Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's ACLU Leadership Forum. For those of you whom I've not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Ben Wizner. I'm the director of the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project and the acting director of our Center for Democracy. To your regret, no doubt, and mine, I am not ACLU President Deborah Archer. Unfortunately, Deborah could not make today's forum due to unforeseen scheduling issues. We look forward to having Deborah back on hosting duties for the next one. In the meantime, I'm excited to join in her place, particularly because I work very closely with all of today's featured speakers. I can tell you firsthand that they have been doing heroic work protecting our civil rights and civil liberties. Before we jump in, I want to remind everyone that this is an off-the-record conversation. So if you're a journalist among us, please note that nothing said here is for attribution or citation. It's important for us that this feels like an intimate forum and a safe space for you to raise your questions. We received quite a lot of pre-submitted questions about our topic today, the intersection of free speech and immigrants' rights. This event was organized weeks ago, and given the recent escalation of protests defending immigrants' rights and the administration's extreme attempts to stifle them, the topic could not be timelier. Many questions received were about the bigger picture, about what the administration is doing and how we can combat it in the courts and via advocacy. For that, I'm grateful to be joined by my friends and colleagues Esha Bhandari, the Deputy Director of our Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, Hina Shamsi, the Director of our National Security Project, and Cody Wofsy, Deputy Director of our Immigrants' Rights Project. Hina, Esha, and Cody will give us the download, and then we'll open it up for live questions and answers. We also received questions that were more oriented towards knowing and protecting our rights when it comes to immigration enforcement. For this, I encourage you to view and share our Know Your Immigrants' Rights materials. We'll drop a link to those in the chat, along with a link to contact your local ACLU affiliate. If you have any questions during the program, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We reserve some time at the end for that Q&A, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button that you see at the bottom of the screen. And with that, let's get right to it. The Trump administration has been shattering norms and abusing power in countless ways. Each week seems to bring a fresh outrage, and it's hard to believe we're just 4 months into this presidency. Most recently, Trump has federalized National Guard troops in California, ordered hundreds of active duty Marines to support the administration's crackdown on immigration and potentially protest. Hina, can you set this situation in some context for us? And how are groups, including the ACLU, fighting back?
Thanks so much, Ben, and hello, everyone. It's really good to be with you, and thanks so much for joining us. So, as of today, the Trump administration has activated approximately 4,700 troops to Los Angeles, including 4,000 federalized state National Guard and 700 active duty federal military, the Marines. To give you a comparison, that's more than the number of American troops in Iraq and Syria combined. Now, no troops are necessary at all in California, and a federal judge ruled last week that the activation of the National Guard over the objection of the governor was unlawful. And a lot has happened, but let me just step back a little bit. So the protests in LA began because people in the city objected to 2 days of dangerous ICE raids that snatched up their immigrant neighbors and co-workers from communities, as well as the arrest of California SEIU President Daniel Huerta. And at the time, California state officials at all levels said that state agencies were capably addressing any issues that were arising. And even the LAPD reported that the protests had remained peaceful and commended those who were exercising their First Amendment rights responsibly. But President Trump has been thirsting to use the military on American soil, and he'd been threatening it during his first term, if you remember, and as well on the campaign trail. So that Saturday night, June 7th, he issued a memo sending troops to LA that was not only unnecessary, but inflammatory and escalatory. It is a very dangerous abuse of power. He activated the National Guard over the objection of the state governor. He authorized sending in federal troops as well as the National Guard, and the Marines were deployed in days. He placed no geographic or real temporal limits on troop deployment to suppress protest. He said in his memo that he could deploy troops even to places where protests were likely to occur. In other words, before they had even taken place. The authority that Trump claimed is novel. He used legal language and concepts pretextually to create essentially a fiction land, a fiction of rebellion or defiance of federal government's ability to enforce the law. And I want to just to emphasize that Congress has given the president, and we think it's overly broad, but the Congress has given the president authority for domestic military deployment. But even that is reserved for rare and extraordinary circumstances, genuine emergencies like an actual war or an armed rebellion, or to enforce federal laws if civil agencies and courts aren't functioning. And there's a paradigmatic example of when it might be permissible. So I always think of 1957. President Eisenhower invoked the Insurrection Act and deployed federal troops in Arkansas to enforce the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board decision and guard the Little Rock Nine against a racist and violent mob. And there, the president acted after the state governor had himself deployed the National Guard to support the violent segregationists in defiance of a Supreme Court decision. And what we have in California is very different. So it was no surprise that California sued. Governor Newsom argued that Trump's federalizing of the Guard over his objection was unlawful and violated the 10th Amendment, which reserves what are called police powers to the states, meaning that the state has the authority to police protests while respecting people's constitutional rights, not the military. And a federal judge ruled for California, and the administration immediately appealed. The Ninth Circuit is hearing oral argument in that case right now. I was just listening to that before we came on. And so that's where things stand.
Thanks, Hina. Over the weekend, we saw quite inspiring crowds, more than 5 million protesters marching, publicly condemning the Trump administration's unconstitutional actions. And I think we should emphasize how important it is that we continue speaking out, also contacting our representatives, and we'll share a link in the chat to send a message to your Congress members demanding that they call on the Trump administration to withdraw military troops and to rescind the deployment order. So Hina, we know that Trump is intent on using whatever executive authority he thinks he has to target immigrants. What are some of the other actions that we're concerned about?
Well, the deployment of troops to LA, it didn't happen in a vacuum. We'll recall that early in the administration, the administration declared parts of the southern border national defense area in a very novel way, essentially turning over public lands from the jurisdiction of the Department of the Interior over to the Department of Defense so that people who are in those areas or inadvertently crossing into those areas, citizens and non-citizens alike, can be subject to prosecution for trespassing. And the administration has also been planning for weeks to use more troops and military facilities, equipment, and staff to carry out its mass deportation agenda. So on May 9th, the Department of Homeland Security actually requested 21,000 National Guard troops from the Defense Department to participate in interior immigration enforcement in our cities, our towns, our rural areas. And the kinds of things that DHS wanted the troops to do included intrastate transport of unaccompanied children, riot control in detention facilities, nighttime operations against non-citizens. And that was pretty horrifying. We understand that most recently the Defense Department has refused the request for now, but it has still crossed a line in that it has agreed to allow 700 federal troops to provide logistical support to DHS for detention purposes. I should also flag that at the state level, we've talked about what California is doing in this terrific lawsuit. But in Texas and Florida, the National Guards have already signed agreements with ICE to do immigration enforcement, with state National Guard troops acting under ICE supervision to conduct warrantless arrests, detention, and prepare a deportation order. So across all of these areas, obviously we are monitoring. Our affiliates are on the job and both monitoring and advocating and working within their communities. Because what we all know is that the use of the military for interior immigration enforcement, especially the National Guard at the level that DHS has sought, or that Trump might further do, that would be an unprecedented escalation, both of the deportation machinery and of the role of the military in civilian laws enforcement. So among the things we've also been doing is working with state and local officials, elected officials, to pass policies that can serve as a firewall against the president's overreach.
Thanks, Hina. And this really is a reminder of how important our preparation was. We spent months before Trump began his second term of office mapping out what we thought he would do and how we would respond. And that's allowed us to provide a lot of clarity to
And Ben,
our,
I'm
yes,
sorry to interrupt, but I know a donor had a question here about the
please.
Insurrection Act, and I
Yeah,
wonder if I could just take this
please.
opportunity to answer it. So I think one of our donors asked, does Trump have leeway to send in the Marines to LA under the Insurrection Act? And are we preparing for the administration to invoke the act? And exactly as you were saying, Ben, we have very much been preparing, and it's certainly something that we're worried about in LA. But not only there, just given the memo was so much broader reaching. And I think our donor's question raises a really important point. What would the difference be between what Trump has done so far and what would happen if the Insurrection Act ends up getting invoked? So I'm going to throw around some acts and I'm going to throw around some terms, so stick with me. The Insurrection Act is understood as an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. And I think people are very familiar with that term, but don't necessarily always know what that means. So the Posse Comitatus Act is a criminal statute that really is an expression of a foundational basic norm in our country, which is that troops are generally prohibited from carrying out direct policing, right? Arrests, detention, interrogation on American soil. And the Insurrection Act, if Trump were to invoke that, would purport to give authority to troops to do that. Right now, that hasn't happened. And we're arguing, and California is arguing in court, that under the authority that Trump invoked in California, troops cannot be directly policing civilians. It's an important distinction. But having said that, the administration itself is muddying the lines. It's already taking actions that seem to cross the line without actually invoking the Insurrection Act, sending out troops into communities with ICE for immigration raids. And you don't have to take it from me. Former military officials and allies that we've been working with have been very careful to say that really invites escalation of the kinds that troops simply are not trained to address. And so another way in which we've been preparing is to work with these veterans and former military allies and validators who are making these points in media and on the Hill, either alongside us or separately. And that really also implements our goal of conveying that individual troops are not the enemy. And they don't want to be. It's the leadership and the policy that's the problem. So troops tell us that they signed up to uphold the Constitution and values themselves. Many of them are immigrants. They did not sign up to report to ICE or to carry out a partisan political agenda. They're not trained. They're worried about the legal and ethical jeopardy that troops will face. And their voices will continue to be incredibly important in resisting these policies as we go forward.
Thanks for that, Hina, and a reminder for folks to put their questions at the bottom in the Q&A button. Turning to you, Esha, let's talk about the free speech side. Hina talked about deploying troops as an intimidation tactic, an escalation tactic. We've also seen the government using immigration enforcement as a censorship tactic. And we've seen the kinds of scenes that we didn't expect to see in this country of people being arrested on the street and in their own homes for their political speech. Um, Share a little bit about how we're fighting back.
That's right. We've seen this administration really take unprecedented steps to use and abuse immigration law to enact a censorship regime in the country. And in particular, the administration has been very vocal that it is going to punish anyone who is a non-citizen in the country, no matter whether they're here lawfully, including lawful permanent residents, no matter what context they live or work in. If they deem your speech, out of bounds, and in particular, the administration is focused on speech that it deems pro-Palestinian or critical of Israel, they will punish you. They will arrest and detain you and seek to remove you from the country. And this is pernicious in many ways. First of all, because it's the administration saying, we can decide what political viewpoints are permissible or not. We can decide what discourse or public debate is allowed in this country. And it's also, been very troubling because the administration has been claiming that it has the unreviewable authority to do this. So in the cases of students and scholars such as Mahmoud Halil, Rumeisa Ozturk, Mohsen Madawi, Dr. Badr Khan Suri, and others, the government's arguing that no federal court should be able to review its decision to arrest and detain them for however long it takes for them to complete immigration proceedings and remove people from the country. In the case of Rumeisa Ozturk, for example, who was snatched off the streets of Somerville, Massachusetts for writing an op-ed. She had no notice that there would be any officers coming to get her at all. She thought she was being kidnapped. She thought she might die. These are the kinds of scenes, as you said, Ben, that we don't expect to see in this country. Someone who wrote an op-ed. And, in all of those cases, we have been fighting for release of the people who have been detained. But more importantly, we've also been pushing back against this policy writ large, which is already having a chilling effect on the country. And we are hearing from students and scholars and organizers and the many millions of people who live in this country who are not citizens that this approach of the government is having an effect. People are thinking twice about what they say, which protests they attend, what they say online, what political debates they take part in. And we're all losing as a result of that because we're all now losing the benefit of those voices and hearing those viewpoints. And the other troubling thing about this, of course, is the administration's position is not limited to this particular issue. They could decide tomorrow that they are going to arrest and detain non-citizens who speak out on climate change, who speak out on the war in Ukraine, who speak out on tariffs, or any other policy that the government has decided it doesn't want to hear certain voices on. So it's been really important for us to push back, and we've been working hard in the courts. In particular, we've been getting amicus support from a cross-section of groups, including cross-ideological groups who all may not necessarily agree with the political views of the students and scholars who've been detained, but who nonetheless believe deeply in the First Amendment right to engage in that speech and to hold those political beliefs, and who see what a troubling precedent this would set if the administration is successfully able to do this. So, we're very hopeful that because every court to look at this issue involving a detained individual so far has said that we're likely to succeed on the merits, that this is unconstitutional. The courts have been pushing back on this. We're hopeful that we will ultimately prevail. This is an issue that may very well go to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court will be called upon to, again, hopefully reaffirm the foundational value of the First Amendment, which is that the government doesn't get to pick and choose which viewpoints people can express in this country.
Thanks. And I do think it is important to emphasize that our litigation is succeeding. It's easy to feel that we're in a state of cascading permanent crises, but it's important to note we are holding the line in the courts, and in more cases than not, the courts are ruling in our favor, and the administration is complying with those court orders. Um, on the advocacy side, our teams in the states have been working to influence and pass critical policies as a bulwark to protect immigrants from federal policies. And this is where our breadth and our depth and the scope of our expertise really shines. So let's just step back a little bit and turn to Cody and acknowledge how unprecedented this moment is and put some of these cases into real historical perspective. And Cody, I think before this year, birthright citizenship had not been litigated in the United States in 125 years. The Alien Enemies Act had not been litigated in what, 75 years? Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And thanks so much, Ben, and thanks everybody for joining us today. A lot of these ideas and issues that we're seeing all over the headlines today were really relegated to the fringe of the anti-immigrant movement for many, many years. Um, I think overall they were not really considered realistic threats in terms of something that could happen and could potentially win. Um, but we at ACLU and in my project, the Immigrants' Rights Project, we knew from the experience of fighting the first Trump administration that, if Trump and Stephen Miller and their allies were able to get back into power, they would pull every lever, they would try every idea, they would do everything they could possibly think of to inflict harm on immigrant communities and to try and really reshape the demographics of this country, because that's ultimately what these policies are about for them. Um, so we started our planning process over a year ago, well before the election. We spent much of the last year digging through Project 2025, through the Trump campaign statements, thinking about these issues that had not really seen the light of day in a long time, both legally and factually, strategizing internally at ACLU with our partners, with our affiliates and with external partners as well, and just overall preparing for this fight. I know we said over and over we were keeping our powder dry because we knew what a fight we were in for. And I think that that preparation and that foresight really set us up to be able to move quickly and decisively to know what the biggest threats were and how best to try and take them on. And I think you see that in our ability to bring litigation so quickly. And the birthright citizenship issue, we brought the first case. It was 2 hours after the executive order was signed. And likewise, in the Alien Enemies Act litigation, which I think we'll talk about a bit more later, we sued the very day that it was implemented and were able to halt the deportations in their tracks. And I think that just all goes to the incredible work that folks across the ACLU put into planning for this really cataclysmic attack on immigrants' rights.
One of the things we needed to plan for, one of their stated goals is to deport 1 million people a year, which is a staggering number. And in order to try to reach that target, they've employed some quite exotic arguments to get around ordinary due process protections that should apply in removal proceedings. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really the through line in terms of so much of what the administration is doing on immigrants' rights issues. So much of it is about just rushing people out of the country without due process as a way to sidestep those protections and court review. Um, so the way to really understand it is that it's all about ramping up deportations to try and hit that million deportation number in a way that eliminates people's access to hearings and to courts. The administration does not want people to go through the ordinary immigration process because that process allows people to make their case to a judge, to provide evidence, to have a trial-like hearing, and to go to federal court to appeal if they are denied relief and ordered removed. Lots of people who are subject to removal proceedings, who potentially could be removed, actually have legal pathways to remain in the country. That may be something like asylum. There's other forms as well, including things that are tied to people's relationships to US citizen children or spouses or others. And the bottom line is that Trump and Stephen Miller, they don't like those laws. They are trying to create new and, as you say, Ben, novel, exotic, new immigration systems to push people out of the country without regard to whether they have family ties, without regard to the contributions that they make to our communities. And so we see this over and over in the policies that have been rolled out in this administration. It's in the Alien Enemies Act litigation. As folks are aware, this is this, you know, narrow wartime power that is now being misused on a pretext, essentially to sidestep removal proceedings and get people out of the country. And in fact, as it was rolled out, the administration made these secret preparations to ship non-citizens off to this horrendous foreign prison that's notorious for torture without even giving them an opportunity to say, actually, I'm not a gang member. I don't have anything to do with this gang that you're talking about. But it's not just the Alien Enemies Act. We see it in the elimination of access to asylum at the border. President Trump is claiming the authority under an emergency power called 212F to rewrite the asylum statutes that Congress has enacted and essentially write them out of the statute book. And we see it in the ramping up of expedited removal throughout the country. Expedited removal is a summary deportation process that historically has only been applied to people right at the border, but now is going to be applicable throughout the country for anyone who's been here up to 2 years. And as part of that effort to use expedited removal more broadly, the government has actually taken to sweeping up people who are coming to their immigration court scheduled appointments, basically punishing them for following the rules as required by the government. And so, in light of that outrageous move, we recently asked a court to put the expansion of expedited removal on hold because it's being used in such an abusive way.
Thanks for that. And we actually received a bunch of pre-submitted questions about our Alien Enemies Act cases, many of them, and other immigration cases that we're anticipating. Karen asked how and when we think the Supreme Court will rule on the Alien Enemies Act challenge. Amanda asked what we think is next on the immigration front. So Cody, can you share what you're hearing in terms of future threats and how we're preparing for them, and when and if we expect the Supreme Court to resolve the Alien Enemies Act case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what we're seeing is the administration is really pushing the envelope across the board. And as I said, pulling every lever that they can think of to try and make life more difficult for immigrant communities in this country. But as you mentioned, Ben, courts are also pushing back, and that has included some key Supreme Court victories in the Alien Enemies Act litigation, underscoring that immigrants are constitutionally entitled to due process, even when it's in the context of Trump fear-mongering about gangs or about other threats. And so, as an example of that, in the Alien Enemies Act litigation, we initially had to rush into courts all over the country just to try to keep the administration from disappearing people before they had a chance to seek court review. And so these recent decisions from the Supreme Court have really kind of stopped the bleeding as the court rejected the administration's efforts to play games with due process and try and sidestep the requirement that people have a meaningful opportunity to defend themselves in court. And so now the litigation has shifted a little bit to the next stage, and that's really litigating the legality of the underlying Alien Enemies Act order. As I mentioned, this is this limited wartime power, but the Trump administration has deployed it on a pretext of supposedly going after gang members to say that basically we're going to set up a new immigration process and get people out of the country. Um, we think that that's absolutely baseless in terms of what the statute actually permits. It's also baseless factually, as we now know from interviews and from other evidence that the vast majority of people who have been targeted by this program have nothing even to do with the gang that is supposedly the issue. They're really just sweeping people up and using this as a pretext to funnel them out of the country without a hearing. Anyway, so the next step, we're currently at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. There'll be a hearing later this week, and we expect this to make its way back up to the Supreme Court as soon as this fall. In terms of other things that are happening, we've talked a lot about federal policies, but at the same time, we're also seeing a wave of anti-immigrant state laws in which various states are setting up their own immigration systems. It's a similar goal in that it's another way to punish immigrant communities to try and funnel people outside of the process, the immigration process that Congress set up, but funnel them out of the country. So the first of these laws that we saw was Texas's SB 4, which we litigated up to the Supreme Court last year. We were able to get that law blocked. It remains enjoined. And we've also been able to block other similar statutes in other states, Florida, Oklahoma, Idaho, Iowa. And to echo Esha, every court that has looked at these laws has agreed they are unconstitutional, and that's because immigration is a federal power. It's not a state authority, and the states have no business setting up immigration systems. Um, the courts that have agreed with us on this include the typically very conservative Fifth Circuit, 11th Circuit, and Eighth Circuit. Um, but while we initially started litigating these issues last year alongside the Biden administration, they would file a lawsuit on behalf of the United States. We would file on behalf of affected immigrant communities. Once Trump came into office, his Department of Justice dropped all the federal lawsuits. And so the state of play now is that it's up to us and our partners and immigrant communities to uphold this constitutional principle that this is a federal authority, not a state authority, through litigation that we're bringing. And this is a very active area right now. And in fact, just today, Florida filed an application in the US Supreme Court asking it to allow the state to apply its state immigration law. So as soon as this conversation is over, I will be turning to preparing our opposition briefing on that. Um, I think that, part of what this shows us is that obviously there's a lot of attention being paid right now to all the horrifying things that the administration is doing when it comes to immigration policy. And that's obviously for really good reason. We're living in an unprecedented moment. But Trump's allies are continuing to push the same agenda in the states and in other forums. But the truth is that we at the ACLU and our partners, we can both walk and chew gum. And so we're able to both fight the federal policies and at the same time push back on these state efforts and make clear you're not going to be able to just kind of sneak in and set up your own state immigration system while we're not paying attention.
If if that sounds like a lot, it's because it is. In my 24 years in this organization, I don't think I've seen a run of work like the work that our immigrants' rights colleagues have done in the last 4 months. It's actually kind of beyond belief that there are only 24 hours in their days, like the rest of us. So let's turn to free speech and censorship and solidarity and such issues. People forget that on Trump's first day of executive orders, there was one about free speech where he purported to say that this government would not engage in any censorship. And instead, we've seen an attempt basically to stamp out dissent in any part of society where it's found. Attacks on universities, attacks on law firms, attacks on civil society organizations. And I'm hoping, Esha and Hina, you can say a little bit about this strategy to single out institutions and to make them submit, and how important solidarity is as a response to a strategy like that. So Esha, maybe you first and then Hina.
Yes, thanks. I think you've identified exactly the issue, which is that pillars and institutions of society that are intended to be independent of government and provide, give life to our freedoms, particularly the freedoms of the First Amendment to dissent, to debate, they're under attack. And that includes universities, which are the bedrock of academic freedom. And that also includes law firms and lawyers, including lawyers who provide legal services to immigrants. And once again, this has to be seen as the attack on the rule of law. And, that it is, because these lawyers are often in the position of filing things that are oppositional to the government and its political prerogatives. And our system doesn't work if these institutions break down. Civil society plays a key role as well, and we've seen these attempts to put fear into people who are, again, working to provide services to the vulnerable, to the marginalized, people who provide legal services, people who organize. The idea is to tamp out dissent. And so this is where I think the role of you as supporters of the ACLU comes in, because there is a big role to play in encouraging solidarity in the institutions and the context that you operate in. What we've seen is it has been easy when the administration goes after a particular law firm or a particular university, if those institutions feel that there's not going to be any solidarity, that they're going to be singled out. They'll be the one university that's punished, or they'll be the one law firm that loses all its clients, or they'll be the one nonprofit that gets investigated and mired in years of investigations, right? Then it's easier to capitulate. But if you know that all of the other institutions that could be in the same boat as you have your back, that they'll stand up for you, they'll engage in solidarity actions with you, it's easier to fight back against those attempts by the administration to unlawfully intimidate or to quieten those institutions. So wherever you operate, whether you're an alumni of various institutions, whether your employer is in a position to express solidarity, whether you're, working in communities with nonprofits that could provide support to other more vulnerable groups, your voice in saying, let's stick our neck out, let's help the others who are under attack. We may not be under attack today, but we could be. And even if we're not, it's important to show that we want these institutions to remain strong, and we don't want them to be singled out and fearful. So exercising your voice in that way, I think, is a really important action. We've also been working to play that role, both openly and behind the scenes. So in the Harvard case, for example, where Harvard is suing the administration, we filed an amicus brief on June 10th expressing support for Harvard and noting that the administration's actions are rooted in retaliation in violation of the First Amendment. We've also worked to file amicus briefs in the law firm cases, again, bringing together cross-ideological groups, with different viewpoints, with different missions, but all standing together to say that the rule of law matters. And again, it's noteworthy that all of the law firms that have challenged the executive orders seeking to punish them for taking on disfavored cases or causes, they've gotten relief from the courts. The courts have been unequivocal in saying that this violates the law. So, we've played a really important convening function there, bringing together groups from across the political spectrum, bringing together groups that share an interest in protecting these institutions and protecting the rule of law. And this is also, work that we expect to continue to do, particularly in the context of helping nonprofit organizations, which I think are in particular feeling under attack right now with the threats of investigations, the threats of losing funding. And we're trying to provide civil society-wide support and convening assistance.
Hina?
I think I want to
sorry,
pick up
go ahead.
with the, sorry, Cody, on the solidarity point, with just highlighting the work of our formidable affiliates. We're so fortunate to be throughout the country. Our affiliates are not only on the front lines of protecting protests, but also engaging in that kind of deep solidarity with the communities that they are part of and support and defend on every single one of the issues that we work on and prioritize as an institution. So, I just think about the fact that last year, for domestic military deployment, we started working on it halfway through the year. And Ben, as you know, I told you how much I hoped that this work would never, ever become necessary. And here we are. But because that was happening, our California affiliates were able to pick up and run with it. They've been going around the clock in monitoring not only what the troops are doing, but also something that I think hasn't received as much attention, terrible abuses by DHS, Department of Homeland Security agencies against protesters, ICE and CBP included. They're preparing to seek accountability. We're working with them and other colleague organizations to provide briefings on the Hill, sometimes highlighting for congressional staff developments that we may hear about before they do. So even in a difficult, some might even say impossible feeling congressional environment, there is some level of oversight and information and pushback and resistance in that context. But I think, in addition to the on the ground work, the insider outsider advocacy that Esha already also talked about, the many, many lawsuits that we have filed and more that we will continue to file, I think our power comes in fostering broader community and inspiration and action. And there's probably no better example, no better recent example than the No Kings mobilization over the weekend that we helped organize, working alongside coalition partners. So, we not only protect protest, but we organize and we participate ourselves. And it was, it's also, just as an immigrant myself, just watching that and knowing that, to me, I think about voting and protest, two, I don't know if we're allowed to have favorite rights or favorite things, but those are two of mine. The fact that there were 5 million people across the country and the globe who took action with this extraordinary resolve and purpose of condemning the president's escalating abuses of power, it was one of the largest demonstrations in modern memory. And I thought it was particularly inspiring. There were over 2,100 events, but there were several hundred that were added on by volunteers after the events in LA. So far from scaring people or silencing them, it was something that was causing people around the country to stand up and rally around and say, no, not in our name. And so Trump actually motivated us even more to dissent. I'm very conscious that, as we all are, I know, that over the weekend we grappled also with somber reminder of the stakes when Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed, and a peaceful protester was killed in a tragic shooting in Salt Lake City. And that was horrifying. And as we try and make sense of all of those things, I think these acts of political violence underscore exactly why our work, all of our work, all of us, which is grounded in peaceful resistance and a level, I hope, of joyful defiance, it is so critical. So I guess I wanted to end with something that is beautiful and inspiring, that from small towns to major cities, people showed up to defend immigrants, to defend free speech, and to defend our democracy. And that's beautiful.
Well, thanks, Hina, for that, and thank all of our speakers for their contributions. I think it's a good note to transition to our Q&A. There may be questions that we can't get to today in our remaining time. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. If we don't get to all of them, we will be sure to follow up after the event. I want to reiterate that if there are journalists here, nothing that is said is for attribution or citation. You can reach out to us afterwards. Makeba, could you please share the first batch of questions?
Yes, so we have 3 questions for the first batch. The first one is from Arthur. What can we do to ensure that court decisions are not being ignored by the administration? Next question from Sarah M. What activities by staff at immigrants' rights groups might now get them in trouble? For example, are we okay providing rides to undocumented people, or could that lead to charges of trafficking immigrants? And final question from Greg. What unlikely allies are coming forward to defend immigrant communities?
Um, Great. Why don't we start with Sarah's question, actually, about providing assistance to immigrants. And Esha, I'm going to let you take the first crack at this since you have sort of mobilized our resources on knowing your rights about telling people what their rights are, right?
Yes, one of the first things we did when it became clear that the administration was going to take a very aggressive position about even providing support to immigrant communities was put out what we're calling a Know Your Rights about Know Your Rights. Meaning we put out a resource that says that you do have the right to tell people what their rights are as immigrants, as people who defend immigrants, people who live in community with immigrants, including your right to record immigration enforcement activities in public, including your rights to demand a warrant where the government has to produce one, and just really affirming the fundamental principle that sharing legal information with immigrants, regardless of their status, is not against the law. Now, I know there's a lot of fear, with people who work closely with immigrant communities on the specific activities you identified, Sarah. And we're also working closely with our partners to share resources in partner communities, including, very specific advice in certain contexts, to make clear the lay of the land here. One of the important things that happened in the previous administration was that we won a case at the Supreme Court called United States v. Hansen, which clarified that the federal government can't use an immigration law, it's called Section 1324, to go after protected speech and advocacy that encourages immigrants to live in the country and to remain in the country. And that was an important limitation. Now, the administration is trying to push that, but I encourage you, if you are working with groups and people who are concerned about specific activities, to look out for those resources that are being shared.
And I'll say it because Esha didn't. Esha argued United States versus Hansen in the US Supreme Court brilliantly. Arthur asked about defiance of court orders, a question that comes up a lot. Cody, is that one that you want to take? Do you want to kick it back to me?
I think, or Hina, do you want to
Or
take this
Hina?
one? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm
Yeah,
happy to.
yeah.
Um, it's obviously something that everyone is concerned about, but I will say that so far, um, courts are holding the line. Courts are issuing injunctions at a rapid pace, sort of consistent with how many illegal things are happening. And while we've seen resistance or trying to kind of play games with compliance, at the end of the day, we are seeing the government comply with those court orders. And that makes sense because it's not as simple as just saying I'm going to ignore this. Courts have a variety of tools at their disposal to require that, and that includes holding subsidiary, lower government officials to account. It includes having powers over the attorneys who are appearing before them and, requiring that they, um, uh, are candid with the court, or they may face personal and professional consequences. In fact, we have a case in Florida in which the Attorney General of Florida issued a statement basically inviting police to ignore a court's order. And we just now, while we're on this call, got an order from that court holding the Attorney General in contempt based on that. So the courts are holding the line. But Ben, I'd welcome further thoughts on that.
No, I think they are pushing boundaries and acting like uh, um, childishly before the courts, but in the game of chicken, they are blinking before they reach the point of outright defiance. And I think that's what we should expect to see. And in a democracy, if we reach the point where they begin defying courts outright, the people always have another move, and that's the next election. Um, would anyone like to take on unlikely allies who are coming to the defense of immigrant communities?
I can speak to that just
Sure.
briefly. I think it's still early. And the battle lines are continuing to be drawn, but I do think we're seeing real movement in terms of where how people are thinking about immigration issues. The politics of immigration have been very toxic for the last few years. And we saw, far from sort of unlikely allies, I think we saw unlikely adversaries under the last administration. But it feels like things have really shifted, and part of that is just how extreme so many of the Trump administration's actions are. And I actually frequently think about that interview. It was, I think it was maybe a farmer in Iowa or something like that, talking about, when are they going to bring that gentleman back from El Salvador, talking about the Abrego Garcia case. And I just think that the administration is violating such fundamental values of fairness, of access to a hearing, of following the law, of complying with judges' orders, that it cuts across some of the more traditional partisan lines or other lines. And we're seeing these stories kind of break through, I think, in a way that feels new to me. Go ahead, Hina.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just to, put a pin on what you're saying, Cody. Um, we did polling even before LA about what people thought about the use of the military and domestic soil. And a significant majority, over 60%, did not want to see the military being used for mass deportation in support of the president's immigration agenda. And I think we've done some recent polling where those numbers have increased. So I think that, one of the lessons to learn, as you're saying, Cody, it's early, but given the excesses, those tides are shifting and people don't want to see their neighbors being cruelly picked up by American troops on US soil. And so hopefully, as we work together and continue to do all of these things together, we continue to make that dynamic shift, because it will take some time to get all of the change that we want to see.
Let's take another batch of questions.
Okay, for the second batch of questions, then the last batch that we'll have today, the first question comes from Debbie and Florindo. What are the most effective forms of resistance and protest? And can I be arrested for protesting in the presence of ICE? And then a question from Andy. Besides writing checks to the ACLU, what else can I do to help?
So important qualification on that question from Andy. Why don't we start with protest and the risk of arrest in the context of protesting ICE. Esha, do you want to jump in there?
Sure, yes. So as a baseline, you have the right to protest against ICE. And, when you're in public spaces where, there's a permissible protest happening, just because it's directed against ICE or ICE doesn't like it, that's not a reason that it should be shut down or you can be arrested. But there are a lot of caveats there. There are very specific rules locally about where you might be allowed to protest, that you need to be aware of. And the risk factors really depend on your own personal risk. Just because you shouldn't be arrested somewhere doesn't mean you may not be. We've also seen excessive policing, over policing of lawful protests. And so people who are particularly vulnerable, people who may be non-citizens, for whom even an arrest could be problematic, what we do is we encourage you to know your rights, to go in prepared, to have a plan if an arrest seems to be, descending into a circumstance where there is going to be over policing or arrests. But it is really important to note that your fundamental right to protest and to engage in lawful protest includes protesting ICE.
And what about ICE? Are they peace officers who can arrest U.S. citizens like ordinary cops today? There was quite an extraordinary scene where we saw a mayoral candidate, New York City's comptroller Brad Lander, arrested by ICE in a federal facility. Cody or Aisha, can you speak to what the rules might be there?
Sure, I'm
Yeah.
happy to. Yeah, so um uh ICE officers do have some criminal arrest powers. They're subject to some different kinds of limitations. Of course, we also have seen them, deployed alongside agents from various other federal agencies. So, I think that the risk of arrests are real at protests. At the same time, I think going back to what Hina said about the recent No Kings rallies, I think what we're seeing more than anything is just the overwhelming energy coming from those who are standing opposed to the authoritarian tendencies in the administration and in ICE. And so, it's important to know your rights. It's important to have those resources available. Whenever I go to a protest, I make sure I know somebody who's available to answer the phone if something were to happen. But the bottom line is that, there are millions and millions of us, and there's no way that they can arrest us all. And so I, encourage folks to keep getting out there, keep making your voices heard because it does matter, it does work, and it is helping.
And in terms of the most effective forms of resistance, I wouldn't put that kind of pressure on ourselves. The question is, what are ways that we can resist? They are all important and they're all collectively effective, and it's going to mean something different for some of us. Some of us may not be able physically to be out in the streets. Some of us might work for law firms that are being targeted or other institutions, and we'll have choices about whether to acquiesce and put our heads down or to resist. And so I think really let all the flowers bloom when it comes to resisting what's happening to the country. What else can we do other than giving the ACLU the resources that we need to succeed? Anyone want to take that one on?
I know we're almost out of time, so I'll just be very brief. I think in terms of helping immigrant communities, there's a lot of things out there. There's a lot of resources available. We've already talked about sharing Know Your Rights materials, talking to and getting to know your neighbors and folks in your community. There are opportunities to do things like observe immigration court, which can have an impact just, having immigration judges know somebody is there watching and keeping an eye out on it. Um, but I also think that financial support is incredibly important and not just for us. We're part of a much broader movement. And we focus on very important cases that are, addressing sort of the overall systemic threats by and large. But there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are in immigration proceedings without a lawyer. And the number one difference in terms of outcomes for people facing deportation is whether they have a lawyer or not. And so I'd encourage everyone to look into local grassroots organizations that provide individual representation. Find one in your city, in your state, donate to them. Those dollars can make all the difference.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you, Esha. Thank you, Hina. Thanks to all of you for joining us today and sharing your questions. If we didn't get to them, and I know we couldn't get to most, please feel free to email us at leadershipforum@aclu.org, and we will get back to you. I encourage all of you to sign up for our People Power movement. You can do that at the link that Makeba is going to drop into this chat. There is so much happening at the city and local levels, so please engage, educate yourself on your local policymaking, seek out groups like ACLU affiliates that are working with and pressuring local and state representatives to protect our rights. There's no doubt that we have our work cut out for us, but the ACLU and our community of lawyers, activists, and organizers nationwide, we were made for this moment. Thank you for bolstering this fight. We're so grateful for your support.